And we're started. All right.
All right.
If everyone other than Paige can please mute their mics, we will begin. Oh, also, all speakers will time themselves, just to clarify.
Okay. Is everyone ready? All right, I will begin now. Resolved, the United States Supreme Court should strike down the death penalty in the U.S. on the grounds that it violates the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Solvency. The Supreme Court is necessary to abolish the death penalty. They should declare unconstitutional on the Eighth Amendment grounds. William 17. If the death penalty is to be abolished throughout the U.S., that will have to be done by the U.S. Supreme Court. Breyer laid out on the roadmap for declaring the death penalty unconstitutional. These fundamental defects make the death penalty cruel and unusual punishment, and therefore are a violation of the Eighth Amendment. The first defect is serious unreliability of the death penalty. There is significantly more research-based evidence indicating that courts sentence to death individuals who may well be actually innocent. The second defect, arbitrariness. The court is in reinstating the death penalty in 1976 acknowledged that it would be unconstitutional if inflicted in an arbitrary and capricious manner. It is usually not the egregiousness of the crime that is determining factor, but rather that there are other factors which case defendants to be sentenced to death. These factors identified include the race of both the defendant and the victim, gender of the defendant, the place where the crime was committed, the lack of resources available to defense counsel, quality of defendant's legal representation, and political pressures on judges who must stand for re-election. The third defect is the unconsciously long delays that undermine the death penalty's penological purposes. Lengthy delays undermine both the deterrence and retributive rationales for the death penalty. A penalty that serves no useful purpose is therefore cruel. The decision should not be left to the states. The Supreme Court should deal the death penalty its final blow. New York Times 17. Leaving it up to individual states is not the solution. The death penalty holdouts are fiercely committed, and they won't stop killing people unless they're forced to. Relying on the vague idea of attrition absolves the court of its responsibility to the ultimate arbiter and guardian of the Constitution, specifically of the Eighth Amendment. The court has already relied on the provision to ban the execution of juvenile offenders, the intellectual disabled, and those convicted of crimes. There's no reason not to end the death penalty for good. U.S. Supreme Court action is modeled internationally and serves as the foundation for international human rights. Krasinski 09. A few years ago, the Supreme Court of Israel tied developments directly to the contribution of U.S. constitutional law. U.S. Supreme Court decisions in particular have always been, to many judges in modern democracy, shining examples of constitutional thought and constitutional action. Foreign jurists all look to developments of U.S. as a source of inspiration. Organized interactions between national judiciaries are both stronger and broader than ever before. Constitutional courts will be forging a deeply pluralist and contextualized understanding of human rights law as it spans countries, cultures, and national and international institutions. Advantage 1, innocence. Continued use of the death penalty leads to the death of innocent people. Tribe 17. Too many condemned people are innocent. In the modern era, 160 people have been exonerated and freed from death row because of evidence that they were wrongly convicted. A study from the National Academy of Scientists concluded that 4 out of every 100 people sentenced to death in the U.S. are innocent. Even 1 in 1,000 would be unacceptable. The court should acknowledge the capital punishment violates human dignity and constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. We should have zero tolerance when life is on the line, and keeping the death penalty around is proving that we do not. Mims 18. The death penalty also creates problems domestically. More than 2/3 of America's death sentences are overturned. We should have zero tolerance for mistakes when someone's life is on the line. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. To declare that the government may commit crimes in order to secure the conviction of private criminal would bring terrible retribution. Americans should consider studies showing that homicide rates for where death penalty is used and decrease where it's not used. Therefore, in our attempts to prevent crime with capital punishment, we are in fact encouraging it. Advantage 2, international human rights. Banning the death penalty is crucial to U.S. credibility on human rights law. Mims 18. The death penalty as a form of punishment in the United States may play a significant role in terminating cordial relations. In the future, with countries that have abolished the death penalty, the U.S. also opens itself to condemnation from countries whose laws are consistent with international human rights standards. When we tell the world that we expect all people to abide by our laws, we cannot in the same breath tell the world that we need not do the same. The U.S.'s credibility when it comes to violate the right to life harms relationships with other countries. Spain announced that it would not extradite Algerian terrorist suspects if the death penalty would not be sought. England also declared that if it captured Osama bin Laden, it would not extradite him to the United States if the death penalty would be sought. The U.S. cannot lecture other countries on the rule of law and the importance of respecting international human rights if it will not abide by those laws and rights itself, especially those laws protecting the right to life. U.S. support for human rights prevents large-scale conflicts, Green 17. From World War II, America invested in interlocking institutions based on universal human rights that would prevent large-scale conflict. There is no other country that can substitute for the U.S. when it comes to fighting for universal freedoms. The solidarity expressed by U.S. political leaders has provided sustenance and hope to human rights defenders in the grimmest conditions. Banning the death penalty is crucial to U.S. credibility on international human rights laws. MIMS 18. The U.S. cannot expect to be respected in the international community if it does not start playing by the rules that apply to other countries, especially the rules that it has agreed to play by. Because the U.S. prides itself on being a nation of laws, it should abide by the international laws limiting the use of the death penalty, just like it expects other nations to abide by other human rights norms. As global superpower, the U.S. should lead by example, showing respect for all human rights, especially the right to life for all persons. If our country truly supports the idea that the right to life is universal, then it must abolish the death penalty. International law is crucial for human survival. Robinson 18. Violations of international law need to be taken seriously is that international law is very recent and very fragile. If one of them betrays the others, the whole tentative cooperation system instantly collapses. In 21st century international relations, this can mean utter catastrophe. Powers have to get along because their mutual possession of nuclear arms means that the stakes of conflict are incalculably high, incredibly dangerous and irresponsible for the United States to treat international law as a meaningless set of guidelines that can be violated at will. Spat upon the international community's processes and dangers of all of us because it slowly erodes the weak bonds that keep the world from collapsing into war. Advantage 3, soft power. Banning the death penalty is necessary to U.S. leadership in the world. MIMS 18. America has cautioned China to abide by international norms of behavior regarding human rights violations. America's condemnation of other countries is hypocritical because it violates the same norms through its use of the death penalty. There are consequences that come with contradictory policy on human rights. For instance, in the aftermath of September 11th, European countries acknowledged their unwillingness to extradite terrorist suspects to the U.S. if the punishment involves the death penalty. Ignoring international laws and customary norms could create severe political and social consequences for the United States. This country needs to think globally. The U.S. should respect its responsibility to display not only political leadership in the world, but moral leadership as well. U.S. soft power is crucial to the maintenance of liberal international order. Hoiberg 18. Historically, the U.S. used its soft power to strengthen its moral appeal. In recent years, America's soft power has waned. Statistics depict a blow to America's global prestige and an increasingly positive perception of authoritarian states. Over the last few years, China has made great strides to strengthen its soft power capabilities. If the U.S. wishes to remain the bedrock of liberal international order, it must recommit itself to strengthening its soft power capabilities. The liberal international order solves great power conflict. Baldwin 18. The international order formed after World War II provides important benefits to the U.S. as well as other countries. Other post-war institutions all help to provide economic stability and the international security, contributing to the longest period in modern world history without war between major powers. U.S. leadership helped to create this system, and U.S. leadership has long been critical for its success. Institutions are much harder to build up than they are to destroy. Almost nobody benefits from a descent into the chaos of the world without effective institutions that encourage and organize cooperation. Soft power will not only restrain our commitment to international law, but it will also provide the building blocks that help solve global warming and terrorist issues. Hathaway 07. It is time to rebuild America's historical commitment to international law. International law is frequently the simplest, most effective, and least expensive solution to problems big and small. That is all the time that I have. I now stand open for cross X.
Okay.
2 minutes on the clock.
You got it? Okay. Are we ready? Let's begin. All right. Does the death penalty have any advantages?
Yeah, so, no, the death penalty does not have any advantages. It is doing doing an extreme amount of harm, including like it's killing hundreds of innocent people, and not only that, it's killing them in inhumane ways. And
Okay. Let me rephrase that. Does death row have advantages?
like being put in so death,
like being put on death row?
Being put on death row, it depends on if the person is guilty of that crime, I would say, because it could have an advantage if they need to face this punishment, but the death penalty shouldn't be carried out for them.
Okay. So can you tell me how the death penalty is unconstitutional and inhumane?
The death penalty is unconstitutional because it violates the Eighth Amendment, which is basically supports the inhibition of cruel and unusual punishment. And the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment because it kills hundreds of innocent people. And not only that, but it's discriminative. So it discriminates against
Okay. Thank
gender,
you.
race.
Got it. Can you tell me how banning the death penalty links to international human rights? Like, how does that correlate in a domino effect?
So banning the death penalty will show other countries that we support human rights, because the death penalty is not supporting human rights right now. It is killing innocent people, and not only that, but it's being discriminative. So by doing that, by abolishing the death penalty.
Okay, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I want to jump to another question. So you basically say in your case that if the U.S. abolishes the death penalty, that other countries will follow, and we need to set an example. Can you give me an example of the United States abolishing something that was against human rights and other countries following?
I can't give an example of that, but I can give an example of us not having the death penalty. Other countries are not, like Europe, for example, they're not sending Osama bin Laden over here because we have the death penalty. And basically it's ruining our relationships with those countries.
Okay. Say the United States abolished the death penalty. Would places like Saudi Arabia follow that example?
It's generally the other countries have follow in our example because we are the role models and because we hold a lot of power. That is not to say some countries have developed over years and years of certain traditions, so that can be really hard to just change overnight. So it really,
if I can interject, we do have an example. It's in the third part of our case, which is the Kurdizinski 2009 case. It talks about the Supreme Court of Israel tying developments directly to the contribution of the U.S. constitutional law, which proves that other countries will take into effect what we do in our country. So that was adding on to the last question and this question. Not necessarily specifically with Saudi Arabia, but it does show that it does affect other countries. So it's not necessarily about Saudi Arabia, it's about other nations as a whole.
I'm just using Saudi Arabia as an example, but I do think we're out of time. Is that correct? Okay, cool.
So on to the 1 NC. I'm going to be reading it real fast. Let me get my timer set up.
Are you going to flash it for us?
No, because we can't.
Okay.
So you're gonna have to flow by listening to me.
Okay.
All right. Is everyone ready? And I will start now. In addition to manage 1 and C, governments are special moral agents that have the responsibility to maximize the public good. This is Latin 2017. In their original argument from adherents, governments are special moral agents, and as collective agents, they have the moral obligation of maximizing the public good. Governments always have a moral obligation to act in the face of wrongdoings, which in the present context are understood as private murders. Governments are special moral agents. Governments have a moral obligation to provide optimal deterrence for murders. Governments morally ought to retain capital punishment as an optimal deterrent. The death penalty saves more innocent lives via deterrence. This is Latin 2017. The republication of a number of important works in econometry, according to which there is evidence that the death penalty may have a clear deterrent effect. The recent empirical studies, which are sophisticated economic methods, claim that capital punishment has a strong deterrent effect against violent crime. Each execution saves 18 innocent lives. The alternative to the death penalty is life without parole. This causes greater suffering than the death penalty. Prison is torture. This is Kleinstuber 2016. Life without parole, death by another name. Abolitionists often tout life without parole as a palatable alternative to the death penalty, a move that has led to a decline in the number of death sentences. Yet both sentences have the same outcome. The offender dies in prison. Both punishments give up inmates over any opportunity for them to change, deprive them of hope, and ensure they die in prison. Life without parole may be worse than death because life without parole allows for greater suffering than the death penalty. Many men serving life without parole agree with this assessment. In the words of one man she intervened, "I think a guy that's on death row, I think he would be a lot better off if they just went and execute him as opposed to life without parole because that's torture. This is cold-blooded murder to stay here. Life without parole is a long, slow, dissipating death sentence." Life without parole actually affords prisoners less ability to challenge wrongful convictions, turning the innocent argument. This is Kleinstuber 2016. Not everyone will agree that living a life behind prison walls with a guarantee of death there is worse than the capital punishment. Although many death penalty penalty opponents argue that life without parole is better than the death penalty because we cannot recite an error once we have executed someone. The reality is that innocent defendants are better off with the capital punishment, with the whole panoply of rights of appeal and review that they don't get in other cases. Death penalty opponents in most states that have high costs associated with additional scrutiny given the capped sentences, the reason they have to abolish the death penalty. The recent death penalty repeal movement has been too focused on cost saving to the detriment of the very individuals for whom they claim to be fighting. The Constitution requires extra protection in death penalty cases to ensure that we do not mistakenly execute an innocent person. Rather than protecting the innocent by eliminating the extra protections afforded to those on death row, the SAFE Act would make it harder for the wrongfully convicted to prove their innocence. Moving on to the next card, innocent advantage. Death penalty is just. Because murders are the gravest of all crimes, justice demands a death penalty. This is Rives 2019. Justice is required from a legitimate society that acts ethically. A legitimate society protects rights, and when a person substantially and harmfully infringes on other rights, governments have legitimate authority to seek to prevent and punish it where it does occur. When a person takes the life of another human being without justification, this is the gravest of crimes. Meaningful justice in this instance can be the importance of a death penalty. Our society is right to value human life because we value human life. We also value justice for the wrongful taking of human life. A morally upright society will promote good and restrain evil. I'm going to be moving on to international human rights. Aggressively promoting human rights leads to conflict. This is Walt 2017. Advancing human rights in different parts of the world is not necessarily the best way to produce peace. When the U.S. overthrew the Gaddafi largely for human rights reasons in Libya, we ended up creating a failed state and situation even worse than it was before we intervened. So well-intentioned efforts to advance human rights don't necessarily create a more peaceful world. We have to be careful about overzealous efforts because we actually can be an engine for conflict. This is something that you cannot rush. You have to let each society come to those conclusions pretty much on its own. International human rights law does not bolster human rights. This is Posner 2009. Academic research suggests that international human rights treaties have little or no impact on the actual practice of states. The Genocide Convention has not prevented genocides. The Torture Convention has not stopped torture. States that already respect human rights join human rights treaties because doing so is costless. States that do not respect human rights simply ignore their treaty obligations. Next card, efforts to build international law trade off with the effective international cooperation. This is Posner 2009. The view that international law is an end in itself is based on the false picture of international relations that can lead to a waste of time, devoted to constructing legal institutions that won't work. The tendency of global legalists to treat international law as a talisman more often than not interferes with the kind of international co-op that actually advances the global good. International law does not create international cooperation on issues like climate change. Posner 2009. I'm not going to read the entire card, but I just wanted that to be on the flow. I'm going to be moving on to soft power now. Trump's rhetoric and policies have trashed America's soft power. The death penalty is not the key issue. This is Fauci 18. Trump's bombastic rhetoric in America's fourth agenda is eroding U.S. soft power, experts say. The U.S. slipped this year into an index that ranks the global leaders of soft power. The U.S. withdrew from three major agreements, the TPP, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Iran nuclear deal. These shifts in policy create an inconsistent and unpredictable U.S. foreign policy that gives America the paradoxical look of a great power in retreat. We have had a crisis of soft power, and we haven't quite figured out how to solve it. Trump's America's First agenda puts American interests at the fore, even at the expense of maintaining relationships with U.S. allies. And at the expense of the nation's soft power, Trump's hardline stance on immigration and unwillingness to call out white nationalists hurts the country's ability to claim the more high ground on the world stage. Trump has destroyed the ability to have a working relationship because of childish behavior. Moving on to the next card, the liberal international order does not create peace between great powers. Other factors explain this. Glasser 2019. The Leo framing could lead the U.S. states to adopt overly competitive policies that unnecessarily resist change in the face of China's growing power. The Leo concept is focused inward, leaving it ill-equipped to address interactions between members of the Leo and states that lie outside the Leo. The behavior that the Leo concept claims to explain, including cooperation under anarchy, effective Western balancing against the Soviet Union, the Cold War peace, and the lack of balancing against the U.S. following the Cold War, is better explained by other theories, most importantly, defensive realism. Soft power advantage. Trump shatters U.S. soft power. The election of Trump shattered the U.S. soft power and makes it almost impossible to reverse. This is Tharu 16. One major casualty of Trump's victory in the bruising U.S. presidential election is America's soft power around the world. It is a development that will be difficult, perhaps even impossible to reverse, especially for Trump. America's culture and ideals set the bars for others. Trump's ascent to power has shattered that image. It has exposed tendencies the world never used to associate with the U.S. xenophobia, misogyny, selfishness. The story of America told in this election has deeply diminished the soft power that the U.S. evokes. Fear trumped hope. The American dream became the world's nightmare, and the demons released, echoing in widespread reports of racist taunts by Trump supporters, will taint everyone else's perception. Soft power advantage. Liberal international order defense. Lyon's theory explains the benefits of the so-called liberal international order. This is Glasser 2019. Key strands of the Leo concept suffer serious theoretical weaknesses. Another strand of Leo concept holds the hierarchy built on the legitimate authority. I'm going to cut the card there. I am out of time and ask an open for cross-examination.
Okay, we're going to do this
is everybody
cross-ex and then end this Zoom because we only have about 10 minutes left. So.
Okay, is everybody ready?
Mhm.
Hold on. Actually, I have to get my timer up. Sorry.
We're going to have a little bit of time in between Zooms just because it has to download and all that stuff. So
Okay, if my timer would come up, that would be great.
I can time.
Okay, are you sure? Oh, I got it.
Yeah, just give me.
Hold on, I just got it. It just worked.
Are you good if I start, Jenna?
Actually, can I start?
Okay.
Please, let's just get going.
Okay. All right. Paige, you can start. Is
Okay.
everybody ready?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So basically, can you just summarize your soft power disadvantage for me?
It's basically talking about how the death penalty isn't causing a lack of soft power and that we need to abolish the death penalty in order to reverse it. It's claiming that Trump's ascent to power and ascent to the presidency has caused lack of soft power in the global spectrum, and
Yeah,
that
okay.
abolishing the penalty won't fix it.
Yeah. Okay, so you said that that the death penalty is not, or that the life without parole is worse than the death penalty, but wouldn't you agree, but wouldn't you think that like death penalties, like, or in the case of like ones that go wrong and are extremely painful, wouldn't that be worse than life without parole?
No, I would argue otherwise. Spending the rest of your life, especially if you're a young person in a concrete prison cell, with
Even if you're
many
dying
people
like
that
in
are-
extreme pain.
the thing is that pain will only last upwards of 4 hours, and having to live the rest of your life with absolutely no chance of parole in a very violent
Okay.
place that would often cause you more pain would probably be less preferable.
I do have a question. Why should we not abolish it?
We shouldn't abolish it because the death penalty and death row gives some advantages to those that are there during appeals. As well, it is probably better to die than spend the rest of your life in prison, as I was saying. As well, my opponents are talking about how some.
Do you not think? Sorry, I'm going to cut you off there.
Yeah.
Do you not think that a constitutional issue is more important than which is more torturous?
Well, the thing about cruel and unusual is it hinges on the execution being painful, and the majority of executions and lethal injections are not usually painful. In some outlying
That's not
circumstances,
true. I do have a piece of evidence proving otherwise.
Wait,
it a
okay,
majority?
so I'd like to move on. So you said basically in your case that like efforts to push human rights are causing conflict, but how are we pushing human rights? We're basically doing it by soft power. So we're instituting these human rights and we're providing an example for other countries to follow in our lead. So how are we like shoving it down their throats and causing conflict?
Example about the U.S. intervening in Libya in parts of human rights, and that ended up leading to a regime and further human rights violations.
as well as this, the likelihood of other countries
I have a
following the U.S.
question
example.
about-
Okay.
I have a question about one of your cards. I think you said that innocents are better off with capital punishment. Can you define capital punishment for me, please?
Capital punishment is the death penalty.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's capital punishment.
So you're saying that innocent people are better off dying than living life in prison?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Can't convictions get overturned?
Yes.
So
When you're put on death
saying
row
that
and you're put in death penalty, there are special cases where they undergo very high levels of scrutiny and inspection because they want to make sure that whoever they're sentencing to death is actually not innocent.
So the likelihood of someone that is innocent on death row being overturned and being exonerated is higher than someone that isn't on death row. So if someone A was innocent and sentenced to life in prison, they would have a much more time proving their innocence if they weren't on death row.
I have one more question. You mentioned a card about, you just read a tagline of a card and it was talking about international something. What was that tagline?
but I think it was talking about some global warming stuff. I just wanted to get it on the flow, and I didn't want to read all of it.
It was kind of
Yeah, what
preemptive
was the
because you haven't read
tagline?
anything.
Sorry, I
yet,
missed.
Yeah.
I missed that tagline. Is it okay if you just tell me the tagline?
Let me find it, Jenna. Let me find it.
Was it?
Even if warming is real, it doesn't cause extinction.
Oh, wait, shoot, I'm on the affirmative. Yeah. It's even if warming is real, it doesn't cause extinction. It was Ridley 14.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna stop recording right now.
6 in a second.